For like centuries, the rulebook for being a man was pretty simple, right? But what happens when that whole rulebook gets tossed out the window? Today, we're diving into Marion Selzman's 2005 book, The New Man, to really get into this idea of a modern crisis of masculinity. We're going to unpack the biological, the cultural, and the social shifts that changed, well, everything. If you're ready, do me a quick favor and hit that like button, and let's get into it. I mean, for most of recorded history, this idea right here, it was the bedrock of society. This quote from Aristotle wasn't just some philosopher's musing. It was pretty much the operating system for civilization. A man's role was crystal clear. You provide, you protect. That authority was absolute, it was unquestioned. This was the default setting for hundreds and hundreds of years. Because that's exactly what the book argues happened in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The very ground beneath men's feet just started to shift, and it led to this massive identity crisis. And the first tremors, kind of surprisingly, weren't cultural, they were biological. All right, so the book kicks things off in a place you probably wouldn't expect. Not with culture, but with biology. The whole argument is that the challenges facing modern men weren't just in their heads, they were literally written into their genes. And yeah, that is a super alarming thing to say, and it's meant to be. The scientist Brian Sykes put forward this really provocative theory that the Y-chromosome, the very thing that makes men men, was actually decaying. He argued that in a few thousand generations, it could just disappear entirely, pretty much leaving, and I'm quoting here, the girls to inherit the earth. And look, this wasn't just some abstract, far-off genetic theory. The book points to real, measurable changes happening right then. A huge study of 15,000 European men found that between 1938 and 1990, the average sperm count had plummeted by a staggering 42%. That kind of data suggested a real physical change was already happening. But the biological crisis, at least as the book lays it out, went way beyond reproduction. It also highlights this stark difference in risk. Get this. A 30-year-old man is 15 times more likely to be in an accident than a woman of the exact same age. That points to a really fundamental gap in mortality. And the list just keeps going. The book pulls together all these sobering statistics showing that men are more prone to developmental disorders like autism, they suffer from higher rates of addiction, and they are far, far more likely to be both the victims and the perpetrators of violence. It really paints this picture of a gender up against some pretty serious biological headwinds. And all of this brings the biological argument to a really provocative finale. I mean, for centuries, women were called the second sex. But this quote from geneticist Steve Jones just completely flips that idea on its head, arguing that from a biological perspective, men are actually the more fragile gender. So, you've got this biological anxiety bubbling up, and at the exact same time, there's a cultural one to match it. As men's physical footing seemed to be weakening, their image in society was going through this massive shift, and nowhere was this more obvious than on TV. Just think about the TV dad for a second. Back in the 1950s, you had Jim Anderson from Father Knows Best. He was calm, he was wise, he was the center of the family. And then you fast forward a few decades, and the most iconic dad on the planet is Homer Simpson. Lovable? For sure. But also bungling, lazy, and constantly being outsmarted by literally everyone in his family. And this was way more than just a change in sitcom writing, It was a complete flip in cultural status. The man of the house went from being the king of his castle to, well, the court jester. This loss of authority on screen was a mirror for growing confusion about the role of men in real life. If that old model was totally broken, what was supposed to replace it? So the old model of the stoic, know-it-all patriarch was basically broken, and into that void, all these new ideas of what a man could be started to pop up. Society basically started workshopping new ways of being a man. One of the first big breaks from the old mold was what they called the sensitive man back in the 70s. You had guys like talk show host Phil Donahue and actor Alan Alda championing this new ideal, a man who could actually talk about his feelings, who supported feminism, and who wasn't afraid to cry. For the first time, really, being emotionally vulnerable was presented as a strength, not a weakness. Okay, fast forward again to the early 2000s, and we get a totally new, much more polished version, the metrosexual. This was the guy who embraced fashion, grooming, and self-care with a kind of passion that was once seen as totally female. Think David Beckham. He wasn't just sensitive, he was stylish, sophisticated, and totally fine with spending money on himself. Yeah,
The whole metrosexual playbook was about looking good. We're talking skincare routines, designer labels, shopping as a hobby, the works. But while it definitely expanded the boundaries of what masculinity could look like, the book points out a common critique. It often just tipped over into vanity and being kinda self-obsessed.
But here's the thing. According to Salzman's book, the metrosexual wasn't the end of the line. Nope. It was just a stepping stone toward a more evolved, more authentic version of masculinity, the ubersexual. Enter the ubersexual. It's a term the book actually coined, from the German word Uber, which means best or greatest. And this guy is defined by his passion, his confidence, and his own authentic style, not by whatever's trendy that month. His focus is on quality, on purpose, and on just being self-assured. So let's break down the real difference here. The metrosexual's main focus is himself. The ubersexual is focused on his relationships and his passions. One follows trends, the other has his own timeless, personal style. One might come off as narcissistic, the other is just confident. It's a fundamental shift from being self-conscious to being self-confident. So the book basically puts the ubersexual forward as the answer to this whole crisis. This is a man who is secure enough to care about how he looks, but he isn't defined by it. He's not defined by what he buys, he's defined by who he is and what he's truly passionate about. Authenticity over vanity. But, of course, that brings us to the big, final question. This book made its prediction almost 2 decades ago. If you look around today, did the ubersexual actually become the main model for manhood? Or did things just evolve in a direction that nobody back then could have ever predicted? It really makes you think, right?
What's totally clear from all this is that the definition of what it means to be a man is, well, it's never set in stone. From Aristotle's ruler to Homer's buffoon and this ubersexual ideal, it is constantly shifting, constantly reinventing itself. Thanks so much for going on this journey with me today. Hey, if you got something out of this deep dive, do me a favor and hit that like button and definitely subscribe with the notifications turned on. We break down complex topics just like this one every single week, and you are not going to want to miss what we've got coming up next. See you in the next one.